She made the Mafia boss's deaf daughter laugh in sign language, and the boss swore he'd never let her go. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The fluorescent lights of the Northgate Community Center hummed with a monotonous, weary buzz, a sound Clara Reed had learned to ignore in the 2 months she had been hiding there in plain sight. Her life had been compressed into this single, brightly colored room filled with laminated posters of the alphabet and the cheerful drawings of children she barely knew. She existed under the assumed surname of her mother, a flimsy shield against the man she had fled, a man whose shadow still stretched across state lines and haunted the edges of her sleep. Each day was a careful performance of normalcy, a charade held together by ink-stained fingers, a messy bun of light blonde curls, and a practiced, gentle smile that never quite reached her expressive eyes. She was just another teacher, just another face in the bustling city, and that anonymity was her only armor. It was a fragile defense, and the constant thrum of anxiety beneath her ribs was a reminder of how easily it could be shattered. Into this carefully curated sanctuary of obscurity walked a man who was the antithesis of everything she was pretending to be. Dante Morty did not so much enter the room as consume it, his presence a void that sucked all the air and noise into itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a figure carved from granite and tailored in a charcoal suit so fine it seemed to absorb the light. His dark hair was styled in a sharp undercut, and a faint, silvery scar traced a line along his jaw, a permanent whisper of violence. His public face was that of a CEO, a titan of shipping and logistics, but the city's true power brokers knew that Morty International was merely the gilded tip of a far more dangerous iceberg. He was the head of the Morty family, an organization that operated in the city's deep, shadowed waters, and the controlled stillness in his gaze held the weight of that truth. At his side, clutching his hand, was a small girl with her hair in twin space buns, star-shaped clips winking under the humming lights. This was Serafina Morty, his daughter, a child whose world had gone silent 2 years ago. The other staff members scattered like mice, their professional smiles faltering before the sheer gravity of the man. They saw the money, the power, the unspoken threat that clung to him like expensive cologne. But when Clara looked at him, she saw the subtle tension in his massive shoulders, the way his large hand completely enveloped his daughter's, a protective gesture that was more about desperation than dominance. And when she looked at the little girl, she saw only the profound, aching loneliness of a child trapped behind a wall of silence. Serafina's face was a stoic mask, her keen eyes taking everything in but giving nothing back. Dante knelt, his movements stiff and unfamiliar, and spoke to his daughter in slow, over-enunciated words she couldn't hear, his face a contortion of parental hope and frustration. The girl just stared past him, her expression unchanging. It was a scene Clara had witnessed 100 times with 100 different families, the heartbreaking disconnect between a hearing world and a deaf child. Ignoring the coiled danger emanating from the father, Clara moved with the quiet confidence that came from years of practice. She approached them slowly, her simple denim jacket and white sneakers making no sound on the linoleum floor. She sank to her knees a few feet away, entering Serafina's line of sight without crowding her. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a placating smile. She simply waited until the child's intelligent, curious gaze landed on her. Then her hands came up, lightning quick and graceful, the ink stains on her fingers a familiar part of their dance. She signed, her facial expressions animating the story her hands told. Why did the pirate put a patch over his eye? Serafina watched, her posture unmoving. Clara continued, her hands shaping the punchline with a theatrical flourish, her own face contorting into a look of comical confusion. Because he couldn't afford an iPad. It was a silly, nonsensical joke, the kind that only an 8-year-old would find clever. For a tense moment, nothing happened. The child's stone-faced expression remained. Dante began to rise, a flicker of disappointment crossing his features. And then it happened. A tiny tremor started in Serafina's shoulders. Her lips twitched, fighting a battle against the stoicism that had become her shield. And then, a sound, rusty and unused, bubbled up from her chest. It was a laugh, a real, genuine, unrestrained laugh that echoed in the suddenly silent room. The sound was a miracle. It struck Dante Morty with the force of a physical blow, cracking the armor he had spent 2 years forging around his heart. He stared at Clara, his controlled gaze suddenly raw and exposed, seeing not a simple community center teacher, but a sorceress who had just coaxed life from stone. Serafina, her face now split by a wide, mischievous grin, signed back to Clara, her small hands moving with an energetic burst. That's silly. Pirates don't need pads. They have parrots. Clara laughed, a real laugh of her own, and signed back. And for a few precious moments, the two of them were in a world of their own. A silent, vibrant conversation that excluded everyone else, including the most powerful man in the city. Dante did not hesitate. He waited until their silent chatter subsided, and then he addressed Clara directly, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "You're hired," he said, the words not an offer but a statement of fact. "You will be her private tutor. Name your price." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The thought of leaving the relative anonymity of the center, of entering the private, isolated world of a man like Dante Morty, sent a spike of fear through her. But the fear was immediately eclipsed by the crushing weight of her reality. The dwindling funds in her bank account, the cheap, lockless apartment she rented, the ever-present terror of being found. A private job, secluded in a penthouse, was not just a financial lifeline, it was a fortress. It was the safest place she could possibly be. Looking at the hopeful, smiling face of the little girl who had finally found a voice she could understand, Clara knew she couldn't refuse. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was an agreement born of desperation, a contract sealed by a child's laughter. And as she gave him her name, the false one, she sealed it with a lie of omission, burying the truth of her past under the hope for a future where she could finally stop running. She had no idea she was trading one cage for another, far more gilded and infinitely more dangerous. The elevator that carried Clara to Dante Morty's penthouse was a silent, mirrored box, ascending the spine of a glass and steel skyscraper with unnerving speed. It was a journey from the gritty reality of the city streets to an ethereal realm above the clouds, and with each floor, Clara felt her old life, the one she had so carefully constructed in the shadows, falling away beneath her. The doors opened directly into a sprawling living space that was less a home and more a monument to minimalist wealth and profound emptiness. Floor to ceiling, windows displayed a panoramic vista of the city and its harbor, a breathtaking, impersonal beauty that seemed to hold the world at a sterile distance. The furniture was sparse and elegant, the colors muted shades of gray and black, and the silence was so absolute it felt heavy. This was not a home. It was a fortress, a meticulously controlled environment designed to keep the chaos of the world at bay, and she was now its newest, most uncertain resident. Her protection came in the form of a salary that was more than she had ever dreamed of, and a seclusion so complete it was both a comfort and a prison. Dante's head of security, a severe man named Rocco with eyes that missed nothing, had explained the protocols. She would be driven to and from her apartment by one of their men. Her background check, run on the false name she had provided, had come back clean, a testament to how thoroughly she had erased her past. She was safe here, insulated from the world by Dante Morty's immense power and wealth. For the first time in over a year, she could breathe without the constant fear that a familiar, terrifying face might appear in a crowd. But the protection was a double-edged sword. She was also isolated, her world shrinking to the confines of this penthouse and the two souls who inhabited it. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and she wasn't yet sure if the safety was worth the solitude. Her days, however, were anything but empty. They revolved around Serafina. The little girl, who had been so withdrawn and stoic at the community center, blossomed under Clara's dedicated attention. Their classroom was not a single room, but the entire penthouse. They practiced vocabulary among the meticulously labeled plants in the rooftop herb garden, the scent of rosemary and thyme clinging to their clothes. They held signed conversations about the tiny boats crawling across the harbor far below, inventing stories about their destinations. Clara taught Serafina not just the structure of language, but the joy of expression, the power of storytelling. She brought color and life into the sterile apartment, leaving a trail of finger paints, glitter, and open books in her wake. Serafina's laughter, once a rusty, miraculous sound, became a frequent melody in the silent home, and her shy smile was now a constant, mischievous presence. A deep, unshakable bond formed between them, the kind of pure, uncomplicated connection that Clara had thought she might never experience again. Dante was a ghost in this new life, a peripheral figure of immense gravity. He left before she arrived in the morning and often returned long after she had gone. Yet, his presence was everywhere, in the silent efficiency of the staff, the armed guards in the lobby, the way the entire building seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of his return. But she saw him in the quiet moments, the stolen glimpses that revealed the man beneath the fearsome reputation. She would find him watching her and Serafina from a doorway, his face stripped of its usual hardness, a look of profound, aching gratitude in his eyes. Sometimes he would join them on the rooftop, not speaking, not intruding, just sitting on a bench while she and Serafina tended to the plants, his controlled stare softening as he watched his daughter's hands fly with newfound confidence. In those moments, the Mafia boss, the ruthless CEO, disappeared, replaced by a father so consumed with love for his child that it was a palpable force. Clara found herself drawn to that quiet, watchful intensity. She began to see the faint scar on his jaw not as a mark of violence, but as a symbol of survival. She noticed the way his calloused fingers, so capable of inflicting harm, were impossibly gentle when he brushed a stray hair from his daughter's face. She was terrified of his world, of the unseen darkness that funded this life of luxury and security, but she couldn't deny the magnetic pull of the man himself. It was a dangerous, forbidden temptation. She would catch his eye across the room, and a silent, charged current would pass between them, an acknowledgement of an attraction that had no place in their arrangement. She was the teacher, the help. He was the boss, a man whose life was steeped in things she couldn't begin to comprehend. But when he looked at her, truly looked at her, she felt seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. She felt the intoxicating allure of believing that safety could be found not just within his walls, but within his arms, a temptation that whispered to her in the quiet hours after she left the silent penthouse and returned to her own lonely, lockless apartment. The illusion of safety, as all illusions do, eventually shattered. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon, the city air holding the first real chill of the season. Clara had been granted a rare afternoon off, and feeling a surge of confidence from her new, insulated life, she had ventured to a small bookstore a few blocks from her apartment. The scent of old paper and fresh ink was a comfort, a reminder of the simple passions that had defined her life before it was consumed by fear. She was so lost in the quiet aisles, her fingers tracing the spines of well-loved novels, that she didn't sense the shift in the atmosphere until it was too late. A familiar, cloying scent of cheap cologne reached her first, a smell that instantly transported her back to a life of slammed doors and whispered threats. Her blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found herself staring into the face of her past. Marco stood at the end of the aisle, blocking her exit. He was leaner than she remembered, his features sharpened by a bitterness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. His smile was a predatory slash, the same smile that had once charmed her and had later become the face of her nightmares. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, possessive caress that made her skin crawl. "Or is it Sarah now? I knew I'd find you. A little bird told me you were tutoring some rich guy's kid. Living the high life, are we?" Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but she was frozen, trapped by the resurgence of a terror she had foolishly believed she had escaped. He took a step closer, his eyes raking over her, and the facade of civility dropped away. "You owe me," he hissed. "You think you can just walk away, after everything? I think your new boss would be very interested to hear about where his daughter's teacher really comes from." Before she could process the threat, before the first scream could form in her throat, the quiet of the bookstore was broken by the silent, swift arrival of two figures. They moved with an inhuman efficiency, materializing from the shadows like specters. One was Rocco, Dante's unsmiling head of security. The other was a man she didn't recognize, but his build and his cold, detached expression told her everything she needed to know. They flanked Marco, their presence so overwhelming that he seemed to shrink before her eyes. There was no struggle, no shouted words. Rocco simply placed a heavy hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture that was both a restraint and a sentence. Marco's face went pale with a dawning, primal fear, the fear of a small-time predator suddenly finding himself in the cage with an apex carnivore. They steered him out of the store with a brutal lack of ceremony, and in moments, he was gone, erased from her life as quickly and silently as he had reappeared. Shaking and nauseous, Clara was escorted back to the penthouse. The ride was silent, the air thick with unspoken questions. When she walked through the door, Dante was there, waiting. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and the sleeves of his black dress shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing powerful forearms laced with faint scars and dark veins. The controlled calm was gone from his face, replaced by a cold, simmering fury that was more terrifying than any overt display of anger. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply waited. The truth, choked with tears and shame, spilled out of her. She told him everything, her real name, the possessive cruelty of her ex-boyfriend, the constant fear, the lies she had built to protect herself. She confessed that her entire presence in his life was built on a foundation of deceit, and she expected him to throw her out, to cast her back into the world she had tried so desperately to flee. Instead of anger, he listened with a chilling stillness. When she was finished, her voice a raw whisper in the vast, silent room, he finally spoke, his tone dangerously soft. "He will never touch you again," Dante said, and it was not a reassurance. It was an oath, sworn with the absolute certainty of a man who had the power to bend the world to his will. "He will never speak your name again. He will cease to exist." The finality of his words sent a shiver down her spine. The incident, the raw and terrified confession, had broken down the final barrier between them. Seeing her so vulnerable, so shattered by the ghosts of her past, cracked open his own tightly guarded fortress. He walked to the window, his back to her, and for a long time he just stared out at the city lights. When he turned back, the fury was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant pain. "My wife, Alina," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "She was killed in a car bomb 2 years ago." "It was meant for me, a message from a rival." He touched the scar on his jaw. "Serafina was in the back seat. The blast, it took her mother and it took her hearing. She hasn't laughed, not really, until you." He finally confessed the terrible, crushing guilt that was the engine of his existence, the belief that his choices, his world, had destroyed his family. In that moment of shared, brutal honesty, they were no longer a boss and an employee. They were two survivors, their wounds laid bare, finding a strange, powerful solace in the wreckage of each other's pasts. The shared confessions acted as a crucible, burning away the pretense and circumstance that had defined their relationship. In the ashes, something new and fragile began to grow. The charged glances across the room gave way to lingering touches, the professional distance collapsing into a deep, emotional intimacy. One evening, after Serafina was asleep, Dante found Clara on the rooftop, staring at the glittering tapestry of the city below. He came to stand beside her, the silence between them no longer awkward but filled with a comfortable, unspoken understanding. He spoke of his dreams for his company, the slow, arduous process of steering the Morty empire towards legitimacy, a goal he pursued not for himself, but for his daughter. She, in turn, told him of her younger brother, the reason she had learned sign language, and her dream of one day opening a school for deaf children, a place of true community and acceptance. That night, he didn't let her go back to her empty apartment. He traced the line of her jaw with a tenderness that belied the strength in his hands, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "Stay," he murmured, the single word a plea, a command, and a promise all at once. The first time he kissed her, it was not with the frantic passion of a new romance, but with the profound, soul-deep recognition of two people who had been lonely for a very long time. Their connection blossomed in the quiet moments, sharing a bottle of wine after Serafina was in bed, cooking together in the vast, unused kitchen, and waking up in the morning to find the other person still there, a bastion against the nightmares that had haunted them both. Dante, the man who commanded a criminal empire with icy control, became tender and attentive with her. And Clara, the woman who had lived in fear for so long, finally found a place where she felt utterly and completely safe. He promised her a future, a life for her and Serafina, protected from the darkness of both their pasts. But the darkness had a way of seeping through the cracks. Dante's world was not one that could be easily compartmentalized or left behind at the office door. His rivals, particularly the old guard Falcone family, saw his growing legitimacy and his newfound happiness not as a strength, but as a fatal weakness. Antonio Falcone, a man who believed in the old ways of blood and brutality, saw Dante's love for the blonde teacher and his deaf daughter as a leverage point, a vulnerability to be exploited. The first sign was subtle, almost dismissible. A long-stemmed black rose, the Falcon sigil, was left on the windshield of the car that drove Clara home one afternoon. Clara didn't understand its significance, but the grim, tight-lipped expression on her driver's face told her it was not a gift. The intimidation escalated. A man sat at a cafe across from the community center, openly photographing the building long after Clara had stopped working there. Whispers reached Dante through his network of informants that the Falcons were asking questions, digging into the teacher's background, looking for a weakness they could press. The promise of protection that had once felt like a comforting embrace now began to feel like the bars of her gilded cage closing in. Dante's security detail doubled. She was no longer allowed to leave the penthouse without Rocco at her side. The freedom she had just begun to rediscover was curtailed, replaced by a state of high alert. The price of her new life, her new love, became terrifyingly clear. To love Dante, Morty was to accept that a target would forever be on her back, and on the back of the little girl she had also come to love as her own. She had to confront the terrible reality that his promise to keep her safe meant surrendering her independence entirely, locking herself away in his fortress, while his enemies circled, waiting for the moment to strike. The romance that had been her sanctuary was now also the source of the greatest danger she had ever faced. Dante had insisted they go to the annual waterfront festival. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to let the threats of his rivals dictate their lives and imprison them in the penthouse. For one evening, he wanted them to be a normal family, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of music, laughter, and the warm glow of paper lanterns. With Rocco and a dozen other discreetly placed men forming an invisible perimeter around them, Clara allowed herself to believe it was possible. She held Serafina's hand on one side and Dante on the other, a perfect, fragile link between them. Serafina's face was alight with wonder, her eyes wide as she watched the acrobats and fire-breathers, her hands signing a constant stream of excited questions to Clara. For a few blissful hours, they were not a mafia boss, a teacher with a hidden past, and a traumatized child. They were just a family, sharing cotton candy and marveling at the lights dancing on the dark water of the harbor. The attack came with a sudden, brutal efficiency that was the Falcon trademark. They used the noise of a fireworks display as cover. A staged fight broke out nearby, drawing the attention of the crowd and some of Dante's men. In that brief moment of distraction, two men converged on them. One grabbed Clara, his hand clamping over her mouth, while the other lunged for a startled Serafina. Time seemed to slow down. Clara saw Serafina's eyes, wide with terror, her small hands frozen mid-sign. She saw the glint of steel as one of the men pulled a knife. The calculated, simmering rage that always lived beneath Dante Morty's controlled surface erupted into a primal inferno. He moved with a speed and violence that was terrifying to behold. He broke the arm of the man holding Clara with a sickening crack, the man's scream lost in the boom of a firework. He then turned on the second man, the one reaching for his daughter, and the fight was over before it had truly begun. There was no artistry, only merciless, focused destruction. It was the full, untamed fury of the mafia boss unleashed, not for territory or for power, but for the singular purpose of defending his family. When it was over, Dante stood over the two broken men, his chest heaving, his hands stained with their blood. Rocco and his team had materialized, creating a wall around them, spiriting them away from the screaming crowd before anyone could fully process what had happened. In the car on the way back to the penthouse, as Clara held a trembling Serafina in her arms, she looked at Dante. She saw the blood on his knuckles, the chilling coldness that had settled back into his eyes, and she felt no fear. In that moment of absolute violence, she had not seen a monster. She had seen a shield. She had seen the terrifying, unwavering proof of his love, a force as brutal and as absolute as his capacity for violence. She understood, with a clarity that settled deep in her bones, that this was the man she loved, darkness and all. The aftermath of the festival was a reckoning. It was the final, bloody punctuation mark on Dante's old life. He understood that as long as he maintained the status quo, as long as families like the Falcons saw an angle to exploit, his family would never truly be safe. That night, While Clara and Serafina slept safely in the penthouse, he set in motion a chain of events that would permanently reshape his world. He called a meeting with the heads of the other families, not to negotiate, but to dictate terms. He used the full weight of his financial power, the legitimate side of his empire, to crush his rivals without firing another shot. He cut off their supply lines, froze their assets, and exposed their operations to federal agencies through anonymous tips. It was a bloodless coup, a war won in boardrooms and back channels, far more devastating than any street fight. He systematically dismantled the most violent aspects of the Morty organization, folding the rest into his legitimate businesses and severing ties with anyone who refused to adapt. He walked away from the legacy of blood he had inherited, not abandoning his power, but transforming it. He chose them. He chose the future they could build over the past that had been thrust upon him. Months later, the city was a different place for them. The shadows still existed, but they no longer reached for their door. Clara stood on the rooftop with Dante, watching Serafina water the herbs in the late afternoon sun. Her daughter, as she had begun to call her in her heart, was thriving, her laughter now as common as the sea breeze. Clara was no longer hiding. She was home. Dante wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her head, his presence a solid, comforting weight. He had proven his willingness to change, and she had proven her willingness to accept all of him. Their love, forged in silence and secrets, and sealed in a moment of brutal reckoning, felt more real and more earned than any simple storybook romance. They were a family, scarred but whole, their future a quiet, sunlit garden grown in the heart of a storm.